Hello, everybody. We're opening up a new discussion in the realm of the Vilenica festival. It's called Europe, Bureaucracy, or Anarchy. It's quite provocative, but so are these times. So are the times today in Europe and all around the globe. This is going to be a round table with, I have 4 guests. I have here Matthias Göritz. Are you now in Germany or are you in the States?
No, right now I'm in Munich.
Oh, you're in Munich, so in Germany, okay. We're close to the Oktoberfest, but it's probably been cancelled.
I won't be here for that, I'm sorry.
Okay, no, just joking. Anyway, Matthias Göritz writes in German, and you're the author of poetry, novellas, and novels in German. You currently teach in the comparative literature department at Washington University in St. Louis, and you're also one of the curators of the Slovenian in Frankfurt 2023 appearance. So we're very happy to have you. And then we have Jazra Khaleed, whose camera is turned off, but we will nevertheless be hearing him. He writes in Greek and is known as a poet, a translator, and a filmmaker. His poems have been published in The Guardian, World Literature Today, and in Lichtungen. And then we have Larissa. You write in English, and you're the author of 8 books. You're the recipient of the Jim Duggins Novelist Prize, the Lambda Literary Award, the Astrea Award, and the Otherwise Honor Book, and finalist for 7 more. You hold a Canada Research Chair at the University of Calgary and direct the Insurgent Architects House for Creative Writing. And we have Lena, Ruth Stefanović. You write in Montenegrin, and is this an officially recognized language?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Okay, yeah, because it's close to Serbian, but it's not Serbian, it's Montenegrin. So, and you're an author and translator of novels, essays, and short stories. You're a lecturer at the University of Montenegro. You're also active in diplomacy, and you're also an interpreter and a well-known translator. So
I used to be a lecturer in university. I'm not any longer.
Good, good. Well, anyway, good evening, good morning, whatever it is in your part of the world. I guess, Larissa, in Canada, it's morning. And otherwise, for those who are in Europe, it's almost evening, good afternoon, whatever. So the idea and the main topic today is to talk about Europe as an entity, a complex entity, and we will ask ourselves whether in times of sanitary bureaucracy, can Europe find solace in a constructive anarchy? What is constructive anarchy? We'll try to find out. We'll have a book, a European book, as inspiration for each of the topics we'll be touching, and we'll also have an excerpt from the literary work of the participants as trigger for discussion. So I will start with a simple question as a parenthesis, without books for inspirations, without a literary trigger. Let's just talk about Europe and the slogans of Vilenica. In 2020, it was expanding and shrinking. Europe, quo vadis? Where are you going, Europe? Now, this year, it's fear and courage. We'll talk about fear and courage later on, but it seems that we do not know much more about the fate of Europe than in 2020. In 2021, we're even more full of fear, but feel a certain courage to go on. But on Zoom, apparently. So Nenad Veličković, who was also supposed to be on this discussion, the acclaimed Bosnian author, he canceled his appearance in this discussion, saying he was tired of Zoom. I have a question for all of us. Are we all tired of being virtual personae in sort of big text film? Are we tired of Zoom? No. Can we start with Ruth? You just go on. You're not tired of Zoom.
No, actually, I'm quite enjoying it. I miss the real life interaction with audience. Last month, I was very happy to first time in a year and a half to interact with audience, and there is nothing better than it. But this is also perfect because in this time, I think it gave us possibilities that otherwise we wouldn't have. Like, if this happened 10 years ago, how could we conduct festivals? How would you and I speak? How could we do anything, you know? So I'm actually very happy of Zoom. And I noticed something very interesting. People of my age, which is like middle generation, 50 somethings, they love Zoom. We love Zoom. Much younger generations, like poets of 25 up to 30, they loathe it, they hate it. So I don't know why is that, but it is so. That's my impression.
So Larissa, what about you? You're in Canada, so you probably wouldn't be able to join us without Zoom also.
Well, that's the thing, probably not. I mean, I would love to come to Ljubljana. So I'm sad to be sort of missing the visit in person and sad to be missing the cave, especially. It looks so beautiful. But indeed, you know, as Ruth is saying, life on Zoom has made these kinds of connections across vast distances so much more possible. And so over the course of the pandemic, you know, I've been able to regularly visit cities that would otherwise, you know, cost a great deal of money and time and energy to visit. And so in that way, you know, Zoom is wonderful. I am a little bit tired of the flat screen, I have to say. And, you know, I just have my little laptop, so everybody's face is about this big. And that aspect is maybe not ideal, but it certainly has facilitated a lot. And so, you know, I'm mixed feelings about it. It would be so wonderful to be there physically in person with people.
Sure, we'd love to have you, but yeah.
Yes.
Matthias, what do you think?
Oh, that's a very complex question.
It's the most complex.
Yeah, tonight I even open another event in the United States in St. Louis, where I'm normally based, with a reading. And, you know, so kind of like hopping from one time zone into the other, into one audience from one into the other. And I definitely prefer a real audience because you can definitely feel the reactions. You can kind of like really discuss it. So this kind of roundtable discussion is tricky in that sense. And I know that you all had a lot of events. And Larissa, I think, and Ruth as well, you have experience in teaching on Zoom as well, which is also not the same interaction as you have, as if you have a student with you in the room. But that is not my main concern. I'm used to work via Skype. I used to do that as a translator of poetry when I was, you know, living in the States, still doing translations of, for example, Slovenian authors or American or English authors. We were not at the same time. So that was always convenient to kind of like get together to get something done. And this is good in a global sense of how we do work with one another. I'm concerned about the power which it gives to the, you know, to the corporations actually. And kind of like I'm really distrusting this system a little bit. It seems to make us all very happy in our own little confinements, in our rooms, in our gardens, in our libraries, in our jobs. And I want the world to be a different place. I want us to connect. And so, yes, we should embrace, you know, platforms like Zoom, Skype, et cetera, but we should really be aware of what we want to do when this is over. So how do we socialize when the crisis is over? How do we implement gatherings, stepping out of this kind of like a little bit distance relationship? So how do we meet in real life? So I would love to meet you all next year and have this discussion once again in person, wherever in the world. Unfortunately, we also know that we are not supposed to fly that much anymore, which is probably true. So whatever we do, we are in a point in the development of our world where whatever we do is full of fear. And, you know, so whatever we do seems to be not completely right. And that bothers me a lot. And that is definitely related to Zoom.
Thanks. Jazra, do you think that without Zoom, maybe the pandemic and the restrictions would be over sooner because we wouldn't have this opportunity to meet online, and we would have to meet somehow? So we would have to meet in person. So it would end sooner. Did you have this feeling?
Honestly, first of all, I don't like the word pandemic. It's a word that the state uses, and I don't like the discourse of the state. So I don't use this term, to be honest. And I think that all these restrictions, maybe they wouldn't be possible if the technology hadn't reached all these levels. If all the people were connected online and all that, because I think for those in power, it's quite convenient to have all people locked up in their homes, and not getting out, to demonstrate or meeting with each other.
We're just actors in big text film. I mean, it's one way of seeing it, but the other way of seeing it is also that it's a great invention. But yeah, it's not more than an invention, a technical invention. It doesn't really work out as far as feelings are concerned, or face-to-face connections. So Matthias, I would like you to read a poem. You have a great poem that ends sadly, but it's a good introduction to our first question. It's called From an Old Suit. Microphone. We don't hear you. Okay.
I'm going to read it now, and I want to thank my translator, Susan Bernovsky, for rendering it so wonderfully in English. From an old suit. My father was a suitable man. He always had things in his pockets, chocolate for the satyrs, fat polished coins for the ferryman. You certainly couldn't impress him with the poem, with a glum face, with nice dry socks, and the promise that all would remain as it was. He knew nothing would remain as it was. Everyone would leave him, shutting him up in loneliness, lulling him into somnolent slumber. Even the album makes a noise, it explodes. Even the grave is a room. And even his suit, or so he imagined, one day the worms would reach with their tongues.
Thank you. I think it's a wonderful poem, and it's also a good, excellent reflection on death, life, and how things are going to change inevitably. And so they are changing with this crisis. And I also like the concept that Jazra said, that we don't use the word pandemic. We'll try to avoid it because I don't really like it either. So, but let's start and let's connect to Edward Kozbek, Fear and Courage. This is a book that most of you probably haven't heard of. But it's a very important book for Slovenia. It was written in 1951, and Edward Kozbek was an intellectual close to Christian socialism, and this is why he had many problems with the regime, the communist regime. But he was also a resistant fighter in the war, in the Second World War. And Fear and Courage is a collection of not 4 short stories, but novellas. They're quite long, they like 60 to 80 pages each. And actually those are philosophical novellas written during the war, and they talk about man's historical mission. They really speak of it, and they try to solve, well, of course they are unsolvable, but still they try to solve ethical dilemmas in war, because war is all about not just about death, but about ethical dilemmas on how to be a man, and what is a man's historical mission versus their humaneness. He asks himself in many of these novellas how to kill or not to kill, whether to kill or not to kill, because he was faced with executing traitors. He was supposed to execute traitors, be it in the name of God, or be it in the name of the resistance, the partisans, or any ideology. So when we were filming a documentary on Kozbek's book, it was during the sessions for a TV series called The 50 Books That Made Slovenia, that I produce and write. And we asked the military psychologists how soldiers were being prepared to taking lives. He said warriors eventually get used to it and killing becomes a routine. We were quite shocked. The crew was really shocked when hearing that. But you know, it's a pragmatic attitude. So I ask myself, what are the dilemmas of 2021? What are we fighting against in today's Europe? Is it the nationalist right? Is it sanitary tyranny? And what is our historical mission? Do we need to get vaccinated? Do we allow deaths if we are not? Because these are the historical dilemmas facing us today. Or do we act liberticide if we do not demonstrate against green pest tyranny? This is also an option. Is fear really the other side of courage? Courage, because this is Kozbek's thesis in the end of the book. Or do we just get used to it all like good soldiers, but in whose name and in the name of which historical mission? Maybe I would ask Matthias to start, because he read us this wonderful poem.
Yeah, we're getting now into the real complex questions. What should we fight for? We should fight for love and connection. I think one of our problems in this moment is that we all feel very detached from society, from life. And history went on. It didn't stop, as we know from what we're talking about later, probably. The horrible events in Belarus, the horrible events in Afghanistan, this is all happening aside, and we sit at home in front of our screens trying to live our lives as if, you know, nothing had happened, but so many things happens at the same time. What we, I think, need is to really develop and sensibility for us as human beings living on one planet, living in societies which are definitely not perfect, which produce more violence than it's good for us, which need our help in overcoming our fear of change. Our world is changing so fast, not only through the technology, but also through the climate change which we really face and which we really see as consequences. As you know, in Germany, we faced that as well this summer with those horrible floods. And we need, as intellectuals, as authors, as human beings, we need to find a new awareness of who we want to be. We cannot be men fighting a war anymore. We have to be persons. We have to kind of like embrace our own vulnerabilities. We have to come to terms that we will not live forever, that maybe even our species will not live forever anymore. Those are really dire things on the horizons. And I think we are wasting our time debating from time to time things which we should have overcome already. So I think this pandemic pushed us back. It pushed Europe back. It pushed the world back to fears which might be real in the sense of epidemiological fears of diseases. But my fear is more concerned with our future as human beings.
Larissa, do you think it is sanitary tyranny is our enemy today? Is it the most important enemy? Microphone.
Sorry about that. This is a very interesting conversation, you know, this idea of sanitary tyranny. I mean, I think we're really in a place now where those questions around the role of the state are coming up again, aren't they? I don't think I fully would agree with Jazra that I dislike the state under all circumstances. I think the state is a, you know, it's an entity that we inhabit, that we may not always inhabit. It may come, it may go. The form that the state takes in the moment that we're living is particular to this historical moment. And, particularly as a Chinese Canadian for whom, the possibility of democracy is not to be taken for granted, I am not in any mood to throw out the democratic state. That doesn't mean I necessarily want it forever. I don't think that the state that I inhabit, which is not in Europe, it's in North America, it's so far from perfect. And we have so many problems here. And particularly, I think here in Canada, the big question that we need to be asking is around questions of indigeneity and land, and as well as around Blackness and labor. So to connect the conversation, to Matthias's poem, I'm really interested in this question of the father's suit, because I think the suit sort of begs the question, of the citizen who fills out the suit, and also what the nature of the suit itself is that the citizen must wear, how she or he ought to present himself or herself in that suit, how the suit should fit, who wears the suit, right? I think there's all kinds of things that are rushing up in that poem that are quite beautiful, that ask really, really important questions. Sure, about the state and, whether or not it should, for instance, impose regulations around vaccinations or masks and other kind of clothing, not a suit for the face or something like that. And I would probably be on the side of, saying that if we're living in a democracy, if we have the right to vote, even with all the flaws in the vote, which I totally get, that in order to deal with something that is a mass problem, that's a species problem, it's a biopolitical problem, it's a medical problem, this pandemic, we probably do need the help of the state. And I hope it would be a democratic state where the citizens would have a say, or if not a democratic state, another political form, but one that gives the people who inhabit the space a say in the situation. So I don't really think of it as sanitary tyranny at all. I'm happy to wear a mask or to get vaccinated as a matter of care towards my fellow citizens.
Jazra, Michel Foucault developed the concept of biopower. So the biological power that lies behind a state. So it's not the power of elected individuals, but it's the power of the sort of professionalism behind the state. So it's sanitary institutions, medicine, and so on. So this is where the concept derives from. I'm not personally, I don't take sides on sanitary tyranny, but this was one of his. He devoted one of his long lectures at the Collège de France to la naissance du biopouvoir. You're probably familiar with the terms, and you, Jazra, you probably do have some comments on
it. Well, for me, as far as I can see it, it's more the so-called pandemic. That's how the Greek state calls it, and all the states. It's more like a management of the global crisis. So if we think that that global capitalism has been in deep crisis since 2008, then all these measures that are taken across the globe lead me to believe that it's kind of measures that the states use to handle the crisis.
Lena, okay, we're sort of losing you. Are you still there?
Yes, sorry, my connection is not that.
Okay. Are you done? Okay, sorry. Ruth, maybe you have a comment on this, or would you like to read your, because you have a great poem.
I do have a comment.
Okay, please.
Because in Montenegro, we are in diametrically opposite position of everyone else in Europe and probably, what used to be called free world. Because normally, when you speak of sanitary tyranny, you speak of the, this is just insane what I'm going to say. It sounds, come across as insane. Usually you have the state like forcing sanitary measures onto the people, right? And in Montenegro, since last August 13th, 30th, when we had parliamentary elections, which were won by right parties. Actually, it's the citizens that are insisting on keeping the measures, on wearing the masks, on getting vaccinated. And whereas the members of new government, they don't respect these measures. They go to mass gatherings. They don't wear masks. They don't like. I do believe that in this, I'm a scientist. I believe in science more than in anything else. And I think it is insane because getting vaccinating and wearing masks, in my personal opinion, is our only chance. And also, I wanted to say that we are in a very special situation. Montenegro, we are small. We are not yet a member state, and I don't know if we will be of European Union. I hope it doesn't fall apart until we join. So actually, what we are fighting, we are not speaking about state. You know, just we are fighting. I don't know even if people are familiar with the concept of theocracy. Because what we have, what our new government is implemented is the strongest possible bond between Christian church and the government. They act like one. And I believe that that was normal in 16th century, but in 21st century, in multi-ethnical, multicultural country, it is insane. So we're in dire straits over here, and I wanted to pass this message on behalf of Montenegro in PEN and several other writers, organizations, and intellectuals like groups.
Speaking of multiculturalism, my next question relates to that. But could you read us your poem called "Hidden Afghanistan"? It's so actual. I mean, it's so related to what's happened now. I don't know when you have written it, but as I've read it, it was okay.
10 years ago.
So you had a premonition, or
yeah.
Anyway.
Many thanks to my translator, co-translator Stephen Mangan. Afghanistan, hidden Afghanistan. Squat astride an open grave at gunpoint. Pale ties, purple with a pouring blood. She's wrecked by the pains of birth, but must be silent before the gunman standing proud in his national costume. It is ruled that a child such as hers, conceived outside the tenets of law, be buried alive at birth as an example to all. The surrounding mountains seemed familiar. I did not know what I was dreaming, and I had no hopes of waking up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really shaken by what you've read, because it's, I'll let you do the interpretation, but it reminded me of Andrić's book, The Bridge on the Drina, written in 1945, and Ivo Andrić is the Bosnian novelist, diplomat who won the Nobel Prize, as you probably all know. And this book is about cohabitation, multiculturalism, Bosnian history. And today, religious and ideological fundamentalisms are rising all over the world. We're going from one crisis to another. We had Palestine, the everlasting crisis. We had Afghanistan, and this could happen in Taiwan any other day. We had, or Hong Kong, for that matter. We had a crisis in Belarus. So almost every day we have a new crisis, and that is silently evolving in the background of the ever-present pandemic, in the foreground, of course. And as in Andrić's book, where according to legend, babies have been buried alive in the bridge, and the death share a child levy rules, parts of the world still believe in converting, sacrificing in the name of religions or ideologies. So this is really strange, because can Europe be a symbol of pluralism, multiculturalism, and togetherness when Belarus and Ukraine suffer from dictatorship and hegemony, and Bosnia still remains an unsolved political puzzle? And my question is also, is the pandemic, or whatever we call it, but they call it the pandemic, is it a convenient mask to cover all kinds of tyranny? And in the end, are we only dreaming under its dream of peaceful cohabitation? Do we have no hopes of waking up, as Ruth said it? Ruth.
I don't see the way to cohabitate for people who are extremely religious in very different Abrahamic, I don't know what to call them, streams. It proved over centuries that for some reason, it is not possible. For us who are more liberal, who are absolutely, I mean, it is possible, it's obvious, like it's what Montenegro been doing since we gained independence in 2006, and I think we proved that. But if there is only one group that is pushing the extreme interpretation of their own religion, for some reason they are pushing the buttons of the worst people of the other side, and then I honestly don't see it. I think it is possible if the society is sort of liberal. But very extremists living together, I don't think so.
I like the idea, and it's probably true, that the worst is triggering the worst on the other side. So this is really true, and this is the horrible equation of the modern world today, I guess. Matthias, what do you think? Do you think we have a future in cohabitation? Can we dream of a peaceful cohabitation in today's world?
Well, dreaming is always good if dreaming is giving us the power to change things. Otherwise, it's more of an opium addiction. And I don't want us to be addicted to stories. I think what made me tick as a reader and then later as a writer was always to try to understand the complexities of the others, and of people who grew up in a completely different environment, in different skin color, in different, with different beliefs. So definitely, as a writer of novels, I try to explore those conflicts. Right now, I'm finishing a book set in the 1930s in Turkey. And as you know, Turkey is a wonderful example for very fast nation building of after the Ottoman Empire breakdown, the embracing of Europe as kind of like the model, a French model Europe by Ataturk, but at the same time with, of course, a lot of constraints, a lot of violence as well, pushing out minorities like then the Armenians, like the Greeks, suppressing a lot of voices of others, but still with a good goal, as I would see, a good goal, laicistic Europe. Going back to the French Revolution, I still believe in the values of the Enlightenment, absolutely. So I dream of that. But I think we are in the phases where we have to apply those restrictions as well. It was still a very patriarchal world which invented the values of the Enlightenment. We have to kind of like have that discussion. We're having this discussion, and we should not be stopped by something like a pandemic or something about the crisis of the future. This is really, I think, our core gift to a bigger world society. Enlightenment values, what can they teach us today? How can we implement that? And how is nation building functioning today? And again, Afghanistan is the biggest failure of nation building in the past. And Belarus, the crisis is not over in Belarus. I translated a couple of Belarusian authors. I'm very engaged with them. Valya Hapeyeva is one of them, who was a festival guest last year. And so what do? We cannot invade Belarus and topple the regime. This is kind of like, it never happened. It never was successful. So what can we do as intellectuals? And that is a question I'm really hoping to find some answers into our roundtable as well. what can we do besides from talking? What kind of like ideas do we have, again, to connect and to change?
Larissa, from Canada, do you view Europe as a model of pluralism, or do you see it as a dangerous beehive?
Oh, is that a trick question?
No, not at all. No, of course not.
I mean, as you know, Canada is also our great claim to fame, right? As we're supposed to be this fabulous multicultural society. And so if I have something, you know, in the first instance to say about multiculturalism, I think, you know, it's a value that's sort of partially productive, but we need to be very attentive to the fact that, you know, multiculturalism here, it's an official policy, right, in Canada. It can so easily become a practice of management, a way of managing difference. In other words, another way of keeping all the sort of minoritized and marginalized folks down, or at least contained, right? And insofar, I wouldn't like to pretend to say that I understand the European situation. I mean, I'm so far removed from it in many ways. Always happy to come. And always happy to learn and attend to what is unfolding there. And I suppose insofar as I witnessed that, I would say it is also a mode of management, maybe more benign than some other modes, but still to be attended to. So listening to what both Ruth and Matthias are saying about, you know, the need to kind of uphold liberal values, that is something I sort of hold kind of contingently as an ideal. I'm very aware in this moment of attending to the need to listen to many voices, very aware of the ways in which Enlightenment values have been used for colonial purposes, right, in the Americas, certainly in Asia, that a set of ideals, and that's why I was sort of like democracy, yeah, but also there's issues. That these ideas, because they have their roots in Europe and because they were used as kind of, you know, speaking of propaganda or speaking of opiates, as dreams to ideologically hold down and manage the racialized folks, Asian people, Black people, Indigenous folks. I just think we really, it doesn't mean throw them out, but we need to be attentive to the ways in which they've been politically deployed. And so it's for these reasons that I also think it's important to turn to other traditions as well. And so, I look to my own culture, I look to Chinese culture, not all of it, because there's lots of really, really crappy, terrible stuff that comes out of Chinese culture as well. But, you know, for my own part, I do look to it for those aspects of it that, you know, open up the possibilities for freedom, for thought, for openness, for living together, really collectively, not like state bureaucracy collectively, but that for me is where the possibility would lie. So sure, I look to Europe, but I look to other places as well.
That's great. I totally agree. Jazra, do you think the crisis is a convenient mask to cover all kinds of tyranny, or are you going to answer with your poem, or are you going to do it in prose?
Yeah, I can read my poem if you like.
Please.
Yeah, it's a short one. My name is Jazra. Here I'm illegal in spite of the left. I was born in the dusk of the West, and this evening is just splendid for smashing fascist heads.
If it was in 3 lines, I would say it was a great haiku, but it's not in 3 lines, but it's still a haiku.
Yeah,
I love it. I mean, it's just to the point. It's very brutal. But let's talk about brutalism in a certain sense, because I don't know whether you know the book by Paul Nizan. He was a French communist born in 1900, and he wrote a book called Aden Arabi in 1931. It's about the society that has been built after the First World War, and he was appalled by it. He claimed that man after the First World War became homo economicus, an entity defined exclusively by the prevailing society of money, and that in a certain manner homo economicus enabled fascism, which is true, of course. Nizam believed that homo economicus was to be exterminated aggressively, brutally, and this is what he talks about, he writes about in this autobiographical novel. His ideas did not really end well. The Soviet Union Communist Party, with whom Nizam collaborated, concluded a pact with Hitler and helped ignite World War II, and that cost Nizam his membership in this French Communist Party. But do you think, Jazra, is an aggressive revolution still an option in today's Europe? We're faced with demonstrations and protests, from the far right occupation of the capital in the States to the anti-sanitary pass demonstrations all over France. Every Saturday you have 200,000 people demonstrating against it. Could we be heading towards a global European uprising? What would you say, Jazra?
Luka, fascism has always been an integral part of capitalism, which means it has always been a part of Europe and the European states. So in times of capitalist crisis, like the one we've been going through since 2008, or no, even earlier, fascism is brought to the front line by the state and the middle class, who actually are the ones that finance and support fascism. And I think that many European states, and not only Belarus or Ukraine, suffer from dictatorship and hegemony. But let me speak about Greece, because that's where I live. In Greece, immigrants who try to cross the borders are pushed back. The Greek coastal guard sinks their boats, beats them, abuses them, robs them. Many immigrants are drawing in the Aegean Sea every year. The Greek state has built concentration camps across the whole country. In these camps, people are locked up, abused, beaten, tortured, even murdered because of their race. In Greece, racial profiling is rampant. Police squads check the papers of anyone who looks suspiciously non-Greek. In police precincts, people are abused, tortured, even murdered because of their race or their political ideas. Police beats up young people who hang out in squares. So in the last 1.5 years, workers were locked down for many months in their small apartments. They were allowed only to go to work and to the supermarket. And doctors have been telling us how to live our lives, and the state punishes whoever doesn't follow their instructions. Besides all that, wages are cut in half. So the Greek state has established an apartheid regime where people who don't follow the doctors and the state's orders are punished and deprived of their rights. For over a decade now, we've been in a state of emergency here in Greece that is not going to end anytime soon. I don't
Larissa,
know.
How do you? Sorry about that, but no, just if you want to.
No, look, I just want to say that maybe all this sound familiar to you. Yeah.
Well, I was just about to ask the same question to Larissa. Does it sound familiar to you as seen from the States? I mean, from the North America.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think what Jazra is describing, in Greece, it's probably more intense than what I'm inhabiting now, because Greece is right there as a sort of, an entry point into Europe, and people have been landing in Greece for many, many years. And I fully believe you and hear you, Jazra, that the Greek state has been brutal. And that's why I'm hearing more acutely your distaste for the state. I think that, all of the dynamics that Jazra is describing are dynamics unfolding in North America as well. You probably see it more acutely in the US than Canada, but the same dynamics unfold here. So, I mean, the longstanding crisis in Canada that I think Canadians, including me, have a lot to be accountable for, and have done so insufficiently to really address and make right, is is the problem of land theft, right? That this is a settler colonial state that's built on indigenous land, and that indigenous people have been sort of profoundly disenfranchised from the land. As Jazra is noting, shunted off to reservations, which are the original models for concentration camps. And so those conditions as structuring conditions for the state, and that's why, if the state were, in some way to vanish, as long as it could be replaced by something better, I'd be all for it. And then the question is, how do we make that better thing, right? Like what do we need to do? So some of the discussion with Matthias earlier around, well, what are the actions that we can take for those of us who are, who direct our lives towards, freedom and happiness and the well-being of all people and all beings? What are the actions that we need to take in order to make that happen, given these brutal state structures? There's the biopolitical for you, right? Really. So yeah, Jazra, with you, and yeah, it breaks my heart to receive this news from Greece, and I believe it, and I would want to fight against it.
May I ask one very unpopular question?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
My heart bleeds about what Jazra said, and of course I watch it on the news, and like I think every normal, sentient human being, our heart bleeds when we see that. On the other side, this has nothing to do with migrations of last 10 years or migrations from Syria, or this is our internal regional migrations during the wars of Yugoslavia. And Montenegro had such a policy that we accept everybody, like Serbs, Croats, Roma people, everybody who was in danger. At least theoretically, that was our politicians were saying, we were accepting them. And it's true. We're a very small country, so this just take us as a bad example. So what we did, we accepted a lot of refugees, which is Serbian people from Croatia, from other countries that were in ethnical wars. We don't like to call them ethnical wars, but that's what they were. And we are right now in jeopardy of losing our own country, losing our state, which we need because we just regained independence in 2006. So I'm saying Montenegro is very different. And we have the problem with, I'm saying once again, it is not nothing to do with nowadays migrations. This is our thing. But the problem is that people whom we accepted and to whom we gave our citizenship and the possibility to work and equality, and they are now against our country, they are against our church, they are against our language, and by giving a right to vote, they are trying forcefully to destroy our own country. So I'm saying this is very unpopular opinion, especially in the West, because the policy should be just open arms and accept, but it's a sword with two ends.
Matthias, to come back to another aspect of this this topic, do you think that economy and the economic thinking is to blame for this situation? Liberalism, maybe?
Yeah, I guess I'm just really touched by this discussion, and I just want you to know that the third or second biggest Bosnian city is the city of St. Louis, where I teach and where I live. So after the war, St. Louis took a lot of refugees, which I was really touched by when I started to teach there and to live there. And they did not do that out of economical purposes. They really did this by the strong belief that refugees needs a place and that needs communities, because that is a problem of our migrations out of war. You know, so what do you do? In Germany, we had this wonderful idea to take the refugees from Syria and to actually get them to smaller towns and smaller villages, and to make the churches the places where those families might find communities to live around, to kind of like get them jobs, to kind of like integrate them. Unfortunately, during this pandemic, nobody is talking about this anymore. You know, we kind of like are fixated on something else. And this fixation, to come to your question, stems from our basic economic, I wouldn't call it fascism, but this kind of like the homo economic theory of Nizon is valid, I think. I think this is kind of like our scourge, so to speak. We have to kind of like find another model of what we are valuing the highest if we want to build and change society. It cannot be profit anymore. And that goes to countries like China, that goes to, I mean, the new superpower who is really building its own economic superstructure through the world, through Africa, through the new Silk Road, etc., etc. And we need to formulate an alternative, and we need to probably not smash anyone's heads, because otherwise we cannot stop the smashing. That's not really, I think, our way out. We have to find a peaceful way of Fridays for the Future demonstrations, of a Gandhi protest, of millions of people going onto the streets. But we have to discuss first what we want. What kind of change do we want? I absolutely go with all of you. We have to embrace diversity. We have to really go into history to understand what went wrong with all our values, but we have to still stand for some values. And I think one value which is coming out of this discussion is that human lives, human dignity, the possibilities of freedom is still something we all could agree on. And this seems to me is definitely not in the sense of a homo economicus who's kind of like basically working within the structure of the free market. And the free market led us into, I think, the problems we are facing today.
We could agree that the crisis is a convenient mask to cover all other crises. The yes. Predominant crisis is covering all real crises in this world. So we have been, so to speak, occupied by the crisis, predominant crisis. Larissa, could you read us your poem in prose, Dear Occupation?
Sure. Yeah, Luka, sure. Dear occupation, know your station, wasting in Wangne Chung Gap, blasting the mishap of opium's cornucopia, the dope of East Asia co-prosperity, no apology after the golly of America's post-war reconstruction plus deduction paid by the rough stamp of made in Japan versus made in China, bullying fragrant harbor's ever open shop. No stop. Even on Sunday, my hawker rushes her cart into hiding as cops bop your survival's illegal, watch the eagle and praise the rule of law. Always say uncle when Sam comes knocking, no flocking or swarming in hordes or perils. Stay feral and leave the critters to the army of uniforms, British, Japanese, or PRC, occupations, your vocation, your relation, and it goes on.
It's fascinating. I mean, I was really taken by it, and actually it talks of it speaks of the economy. It speaks of politics. It speaks of the cops. It has everything in it what we've been talking about. So it's really something that sums up what we have been discussing. But it made me think of George Orwell. The Homage to Catalonia is a book he wrote during the Spanish Civil War in 1938. This is an interesting approach to how to tackle fascisms. Probably you have all heard of it, maybe not, although you have read it, but it's worth a read. So it's about the local and the central. It's about war, civil war this time, and it's against all kinds of fascism and fascisms. It's actually the Spanish Civil War was everybody was against everybody. Sections were against sections. POUM was against the Republican Army. It wasn't sort of an anarchy. But then George Orwell drew a really interesting conclusion, and he was actually promoting historical anarchy in the noble Orwellian sense, as the prevalence of local authority and self-governance over a centralized global power. Is this still an option, historical anarchy for real and limitless freedom? Because on the other hand, we have a possibility to disappear in an ever more central bureaucracy, which is the case in Europe and also probably in North America. Larissa, what would you say?
Thank you, Luka. It's a great question. I haven't read this particular Orwell book, but you make me want to. And I think that, what you're suggesting, what you've just suggested just now about a kind of anarchy that holds up the authority of the local and self-governance, that strikes me as useful, as opposed to these, large bureaucracies. I think of China, of course, in the first instance, and it stresses me out to no end. What's interesting here in your question, because my poem in the first instance is thinking about the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong in the 40s. So in the same period that Orwell is writing about, or just after, but in a very different geography. And of course, Hong Kong was a British colony at the time that Japan invaded. And so there's a set of layers of different kinds of fascism working in the service of a set of complicated imaginations of race and nation. In that place, it's not a civil war, right, that's unfolding in Hong Kong in my poem. But it's interesting to sort of think about it in relation to what was happening in Spain in the 30s. And I guess if there was a piece, that I'd want to return to connect us up to the conversation that we were having before I read. Sure, neoliberalism, the rise of the intensification of the long-standing tyranny of capitalism, if you like, is an issue. And I think that's maybe where we might get at that problem that Ruth is talking about. So that figure of the ungrateful immigrant is a very powerful figure here in North America as well. Had it laid on my own person plenty. And I think that one of the things that we forget when we raise the specter of that figure is how much the West destabilized the rest of the world, right, for economic reasons that were both capitalist and colonialist at the same time. And so that when, Montenegro, sure, but probably more pressingly, Britain, Spain, Germany, France, say, oh, we're being so gracious and kind, America and Canada too, by letting immigrants in, they forget how much their own activities overseas across the world have destabilized, and if I might be so bold, robbed from the people. Sometimes it happens through complex routes, so it's not a direct one-to-one relationship, but nevertheless, it is the capitalism and colonialism of the powerful states, and not just to shake a fist at Europe because China, is doing it now as well. But so I'm thinking about a dynamic rather than trying to point fingers at people because of who they are, right? I'm thinking about structures and what the violence that has been enacted in the name of those structures. I would say that something's owed, that, the people who are coming in because they've been destabilized from that center in the first place. And so it's not an act of charity to take in refugees. It's a responsibility. And that's something that we can tend to forget.
But Jazra, do you think that focusing on the local community, as opposed to a central government, would solve things, would counter violence, would stop people beating other people?
Well, sure, we should focus on local societies, on local communities, and trying to strengthen all the working class, anti-fascist, anti-racist groups there. And what I want to say is, like, we cannot just stand and watch racists beating up people, or fascists beating up, abusing immigrants or women or trans people, and, you know, say, okay, what we will do, it's only a peaceful demonstration. Yeah, I'm a peaceful human being, but, you know, we should do something more than watching other people, racist and fascist, beating up people.
Ruth, what's your stand on anarchy historically?
I'm all for it. I honestly, because I'm my education is in humanism, but I don't really understand all the details how a society would function in anarchy. But I am strongly against the state. I lived in many countries. I haven't lived in Sweden or all these countries that they always give as example, but most of the Europe, Far East, and I never seen a country that is functional in a way that I would like it, that it would be humane, that it would be really for the people. It's always, in my opinion, a big bully. So I'm absolutely for and pro-anarchism. And albeit I studied Bakunian and in university and on my own, and I cannot say that I fully understand how it could be implemented and how it would function. And also, I need to say that there is a difference, I believe, in anarchy in Slovenia and anarchy in Montenegro. I believe that in certain aspects you are much more advanced as society than we are. So it's a big question, you know, whether in some societies it can function at all. But I'm really for the state to go away, because it is tyranny anyway. It is tyranny, and it is bad. And in our case, it is reinforcing capitalism of the worst kind, where, like you are speaking of colonies, that's bad, but they are colonizing our own people and using us as a cheap labor. And like me, honestly, I'm totally against the state.
Well, anarchy in the Orwellian sense is not meant to be a chaos. It's meant to be a system.
I know.
It's an organized system. I'm not inciting any chaos. It's an organized system of smaller communities self-governing themselves. And this was an option, not just theoretical. He was really into it practically. It came to being, self-governance came to being in a certain sense in Yugoslavian socialism, although it didn't really work out. It was Kardel's idea. But, you know, it's probably still an option to have smaller communities and dissolve bigger entities like the state. But Matthias, do you think dissolving bigger entities would lead to a solution in Europe?
Oh, this again, questions for the ages. I would like to start with the people. And so with us, you know, decolonization, the analysis of our dreams, of our liberal dreams, of our communist dreams, of our anti-fascist dreams, that is something which we, I think, still have to do in an honest way. Are we able to embrace the other people? Are we open to become citizens of the world? Are we open to restructure our cities, our communities, to make them more fluid, to make our identities more welcoming to other forms of living? I think this is our question. And that question is not directly related to regime changes of, we dissolve states, nation states. I mean, that was my hope for Europe, for the European Union, which unfortunately turned out to be a purely economical union. It should have become a political union. That was my hope for the United Nations, and that was the idea of the United Nations, to become a forum of a globalized possibility of exchanging ideas in a more or less democratic fashion in order to solve problems which we are all part of. And I think it really starts with us and with our fears of losing. But what now? What do we have to lose? I mean, we might lose. The next generations might lose everything, right? So what do we have to lose? We can be open, we can be full of courage, because we should know that we are at the brink of extinction, that the world is not turning for the better, that the ways of our lifestyle were wrong. So let's kind of like ask ourselves, so how could we envision our life to be better, not only for this planet, but for our neighbors? You know that I'm I fancy this quote from Kotzbeck, my neighbor on the clouds, very well, because it kind of like has this idea that everyone on the world could be connected, even in this kind of like fancy sky or in literature or in feelings. And we have to make that a reality. We have to embrace. How?
Which ways?
How? By inviting each other, by constructing an invitive environment.
Do you believe
by not calling people, or maybe we have to call people who are refugees, but to make them citizens of where they are. If they come to Munich, if they come to St. Louis, they should be able to work. They should be able to participate. And this is exactly where Orwell is right. Smaller entities are functioning better than big states on that level. And
as opposed to the Orwellian vision, there are thinkers today who think that maybe in the course, the pandemic has shown a way to new challenges for bigger entities like Europe. And Slavoj Žižek, the philosopher, has written an article it was published in May in Le Monde, in the French newspaper Le Monde, and has analyzed the pandemic crisis as a European failure, which it is, in a certain sense, on the sanitary and foreign policy grounds. There were many unilateral decisions that could have been avoided with a common sanitary policy in Europe. And but Žižek also views it as an opportunity to reunite again, to find common ground again on economic decisions coming from the welfare state, which Europe is supposed to be, or a welfare confederation of sorts, but based on common culture, common education, on a common sanitary system, and solidarity, which is really probably the most important. And I ask myself in this constellation, this is my final question, what is the role of the intellectual in the new Europe? Can you define whether intellectuals still play an important role in the redefinition of society, as they did in the fall of totalitarianism in the 1980s? This is my final question for all of you. And Ruth, you already have an answer.
No. I remember the times of dissidents, and I remember how their word mattered, before the fall of Berlin Wall and afterwards, and how important intellectuals were as a class. And I think that sadly right now some influencer in brackets from Instagram with 5-6 million followers who are kids of 15 years old, They have much more influence than all of our beautiful and super smart group together. I might be depressed. I don't know. This is just my impression.
Okay, Larissa, you might have another opinion.
Oh, well, yes and no. I mean, I'm with Ruth on, I absolutely see what you're saying, Ruth, in terms of, you know, the young folks are all on social media, and the influence of social media is so incredibly powerful. I mean, here in North America,
is it to give up on intellectualism?
No, absolutely not. So that would be my other.
Of course not.
You know, here in North America, I blame Rupert Murdoch for so much of the crayhem that's happening out here. But I would actually call for, I mean, the question is how possible it is. I think that intellectuals are absolutely necessary, and that, you know, it's the intellectuals who hold the capacity to see the interrelations, thinking of the pandemic. And if it's taught us anything, I think it's taught us, you know, how profoundly related we are to one another, right? Just through our very breath, we're related to one another in the pandemic. But yeah, so I would say that, you know, we need the capacity for thought. We need the capacity for debate. We need to be able to disagree, but disagree in real ways, not about, I think it's white, no, I think it's black. We have to be able to do it, you know, with recourse to a knowledge of history, with all of the critical traditions that we inherit from a range of places, that we're still able to speak, we're still able to communicate. I would wish for a stronger role for intellectuals. I think that we might be in a bit of a crisis now in terms of how to make that happen. I think that the society in North America, for sure, has become much, much more anti-intellectual than it ever was. And I think it always has been in North America, more deeply anti-intellectual than Europe. That's one of the things I'm always happy to come to Europe for, is that people are willing to think in complex ways, know their history, have read things, right? When I come to Europe, it's not always the case here. So I'm in favor of the intellectuals. I mean, I think we also need to be thinking about, you know, that move from thought to action. It's still like, we've never sorted it out. It's still not sorted out. We don't have an answer. I think it's something intellectuals can contribute to. We need the organizers as well. We need the people on the ground, and there needs to be a conversation across. I think that's probably the most important thing.
Jazra, intellectuals have proven to be the intelligentsia, let's say the foreground, the avant-garde. And so was Václav Havel in the 1980s. So was Miloš Forman and those Czech intellectuals, Milan Kundera. Well, I'm just naming Czech people because they were really in the foreground at that time. But in Slovenia, a lot of intellectuals like Nico Grafenauer and the circle around Nova Revija were really they were constitutive of our new democracy. And the intellectual is really someone who you can relate to and who can change societies. Jazra, do you think an intellectual is still able to stop fascism?
Well, I wouldn't. First of all, I wouldn't define myself as an intellectual. I mean, what is an intellectual? Maybe all people are intellectuals in a way or another, you know. But for example, here in Greece, what we call intellectuals, actually they are silent about all these things I spoke about, and they reproduce all the racist discourse, you know, the racist and sexist discourse actually. But I define myself as a writer, and I think that poetry and literature in general can work on the level of discourse because we work with language, right? We are writers, poets, you know. So literature and poetry specifically can help us fight you know, the fascist, racist, sexist discourse that is so prevalent across Europe nowadays. And I know that in Europe and in Greece in particular, there are many people who fight against fascism and racism. And I think that, well, we writers, we can be part of this anti-fascist and working class discourse. And as Larissa said, we should get organized. I mean, we should join all the anti-fascist working class groups. We can help publishing magazines. We can go to demonstrations. We can put posters on the wall. And I think poetry can be part of this discourse or literature in general.
So writers, civil society is the answer. Matthias, do you think intellectual is even a concept anymore?
Frankly speaking, no. I think in our times it really shifted. But I really like what Jazra said. I think we can redefine what we are doing as part of the creation of a new social fabric. So I see myself more as a creator. I mean, when I write, I try to nowadays, as you all know, there's no clear role for us as writers. I mean, we are no longer the Günter Grasses or the Nobel Prize winners of the past who are always kind of like, called by when there's a crisis and then the wise old man is asked or whatever. And this is good that we don't have that role anymore. It was also, I think, always a little bit artificial. So what I mean is, like Jazra said, what can you engage with? What kind of like social groups can you engage with? How can you mingle your voice and make your ideas relevant? How can you get involved into teaching, for example? This is how I get involved into teaching literature, not to just like the smart, brilliant students, but to really people like refugees, for example, to make them write, to make them create. To make them feel at home, maybe in a new language and in a new society. I think those are roles, transitional roles, which we have as writers, as poets, as thinkers, and to kind of like explore ideas and their possibilities for turning into new ways of life, new ways of communication. That kind of like excites me, and that still gives me hope and gives me probably also the courage to go on.
Well, thank you all for this very interesting discussion. I think we covered many topics, many questions to which we obviously didn't have the answers because there are no answers. And it was important to have a dialogue with all of you. I think it is important to have a dialogue in society because society is based on dialogue, just like Plato was writing his dialogues. And it is important to talk, but we also established that it is even more important and also important to act. So we, the writers and the civil society, the PEN Sloven, the PEN International, the Writers Associations, I think we all agree that we have a really important role to play and that we must not neglect our role. So I will thank the Društvo slovenskih pisateljev, the organizers of Vilenica, the Writers Associations, and I will thank you, Matthias, Ruth, Larissa, and Jazra for this wonderful conversation. And I wish you all the best to Montenegro, to Canada, to Germany, and to Greece. And I wish all the best to our European and global societies.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Luka.
Thank you.
Hvala lepa, dobro večer.
Hvala vam, hvala vam, sem hvala.